Before we get to this talk, there are some really important things we need to take into consideration. We need to remember. And they're so obvious that I think we sometimes forget to say them. This might feel a little bit like preaching to each other's choir, but I think it's important that we put it out in the open. Caring for kids is obviously really fun. It's immensely rewarding. It's why we chose this field. It's why I chose it. It's why all of you have chosen it. But at the same time, it can be immensely painful. I remember teachers of mine in pediatrics. I ended up doing child psychiatry, but my pediatric teachers and my child psychiatry teachers said there will be these immensely exciting, wonderful times as you watch kids come of age and grow up, but then some kids won't, and that's so painful. So I think we all know that, and it's rarely explicitly talked about, and it's especially rarely explicitly talked about as really part of our job as a doctor. I think as we've gotten better at taking care of kids and stopping them from passing away, we've sort of, to some extent, abdicated our responsibility to stay with families and with communities to help them through the whole life cycle, which includes people passing on. So I don't mean that to sound preachy. I just think we need to make that explicitly apparent as I begin to give, especially a topic like this, give a talk on a topic like this. So we're aware of this, but we still have to remind ourselves. That's really the bottom line. So I wanted to make that clear, and it always brings back to me. I was a high school English teacher for a while. I'm a novelist, so I'm always thinking of authors that meant a lot to me. William Carlos Williams, as all of you may know, he was a modernist poet, also a pediatrician. Robert Coles was a child psychiatrist, one of my teachers, actually. Coles wrote the introduction to a wonderful set of short stories called The Doctor's Stories that were basically stories about William's life and caring for kids, both who lived and didn't live. And Coles thought because he liked William so much that he wanted to be a pediatrician. Coles ended up doing child psychiatry. But when Coles, the young Robert Coles, who was at that point in medical school, went to Dr. Williams and said, hey, I want to be a pediatrician, Williams said, I'm just going to read directly from the slide. He said, look, I know you like it. You like the kids, but keep your spirits high. But can you go after them, hold them down, and stick needles in them and be deaf to their noise? And so it's like he almost like wrote a little poem just by speaking, which is why Williams was so amazing. What I always gleaned from that was there is this potential naive way we have of thinking about taking care of kids, especially medical students. So I think this is something that all of you could pass on to your medical students. It is absolutely wonderful and fantastic to take care of kids. It can also be immensely sad and difficult, and some of that comes from enduring the pain of the kids and enduring the pains of the people around them. So if we keep that in mind explicitly, it makes us better able to assume that kind of role that we've been given and are privileged to have. You know, the flip side of this is what the doctor says to Laertes in Shakespeare's Hamlet. If you remember, Ophelia happens to die, and he says, look, should we profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls? That's from Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet. It's hard to take the English teacher out of me. What's Shakespeare mean there, or what does the doctor mean there? What he's basically saying is, don't make us ravage ourselves so much over the loss of Ophelia that we forget to celebrate her life, that we forget to sort of recognize that there was a life cycle and an arc to her life. And part of our job as physicians is to continue preserving the sanctity of life even after our patients have passed away. And we do that by helping those around that patient to move forward. And that's especially the case in schools, which are, after all, organic communities. So I wanted to begin with what may sound a little bit preachy, but also I think is super important, making explicit these notions that I think we all know, but sometimes forget in the kind of very, very busy day-to-day work that we do. So what's our agenda? What we're going to do is review the literature, and it's brief because there's not much literature. As I said, as we've moved forward and gotten so good technically at taking care of patients and kids especially and having them not die, when they do die, we tend not to write about it so much. And in fact, if you wander through the medical literature, through various search engines, PubMed, Ovid, things like that, you'll find that there's not much literature, and most literature actually comes from the nursing literature. So that's what we're going to turn to a little bit here. In doing that, we're going to talk about the effects that these moments have on doctors and on schools, and you'll see that actually there's a fairly overlapped Venn diagram there, which I think is important to recognize. Doctors and schools feel kind of equally at a loss often about what to do here. And then we'll talk about very specific things you can do in guiding schools should they come to you and ask for your advice when somebody in their community passes away. So, again, things that we know but are worth saying, in developed countries, we're just not used to seeing kids die. It doesn't happen except in hospitals. That's where kids tend to pass away. In other countries, and I've spent some time in developing countries, they're much better at this. The physicians there are much more comfortable shepherding families and communities through this process. But in our nation, we are lucky enough to have the technological expertise to not have as many kids pass away. And then when they do, which is of course horribly sad, it happens in the hospital, and the hospitals are left to sort of take care of it. And the communities sometimes feel a little bit left out of this process, especially the schools do. We tend to feel a little bit unprepared for this outside of the hospitals. We're not sure what to say. We're not sure what to feel. And you know what? It turns out that even in the hospitals, according to an awful lot of data, and I'm going to show you data now spanning probably 10 plus years, we're still unclear. It's not taught in classrooms. The mention is made in medical schools. I'm in charge of the medical school curriculum for psychiatry here at Harvard, and we make mention of it, but I still don't think we give enough time to it, in part because it's a really hard thing to talk about. So this is just an article from a journal literally called Death Studies that was in 1997 that basically noted that even within hospitals around the developing world, this happened to be in Europe, nurses, doctors, people kind of run from the death when it happens. They don't do it on purpose. They're not trying to be callous. It tends to get handed over to the chaplains there. The problem there is that the chaplains are not familiar necessarily to the families, but the doctors are. So the families are really looking to the doctors and the caregivers to be the ones who help them process their grief. There was an international work group on death, dying, and bereavement that was formed in 1993. It was a consortium, as you might imagine, of physicians and physician extenders and social scientists, and they basically said, look, as we've gotten better at keeping people alive and not having them die, we've actually gotten not so great at helping others to understand the grieving process. So we haven't studied it as much as we ought to, and they came up with these kind of policy statements, which seemed like the kind of obvious statements to make, but again, they wanted to make explicit. They said that healthcare professionals need to be emotionally available. Now that's super easy to say. It's actually awfully hard to do. You're very, very busy. This is not an outcome you wanted. My dad was an intensive care physician. I remember I would come home from school when I was a kid growing up, and he would be in a bad mood, and my mom would say, well, your father lost a patient today. And it wasn't, in retrospect, a bad mood so much as my dad was trying somehow to process it, and he needed actually to talk to other people in the profession so he could feel some sort of connectedness, to feel kind of support from that, and that was what he would often do. Those kinds of tricks, like going and talking to your colleagues about how difficult this is, what a hard time you're having with it, that's almost never explicitly taught. That was the second conclusion of this international work group. And to do that, to accomplish these supportive mechanisms, they said there were three necessary components. And again, you might say, well, of course these components are in existence, and then we should ought to take a step back and think, well, if they're in existence, why haven't we followed them? The first one was a willingness to accompany children and families through the process. So you can't run away. Maybe the fifth time I've said that, but that's because it's so important. We don't run away on purpose. This is not an indictment. We step away because we feel unsure of what to do, and it is very uncomfortable to be in that position of uncertainty. We have to be empathic. That's a hard term, actually. It's different from sympathetic. Empathic means you're willing to put yourself in that other person's shoes. I have children. Whenever I find myself kind of placed in the shoes of parents who have lost a child, maybe from my work in the transplant service, maybe in my community where I live, it's incredibly painful and difficult, and I need to be able to recognize its painfulness, because that makes me better able to tolerate it. To do that, we have to remain open-minded about how we might be affected by the process of caring for these families and these kids. And it stirs up all sorts of feelings. That's the subject of a different talk, but it's an important one to keep into consideration. It stirs up feelings of anger, of guilt, you can play the what-if game forever. I want us all to have those thoughts at the forefront of how we think about taking care of patients as we move forward with this talk, because those are going to help guide us in guiding schools who feel kind of equally at a loss. 10 years after that paper I showed you, or a little bit less than 10 years in Europe, we're still trying to get this right. This is from the journal Bioethics Forum, and they basically said, look, this communication occurs among children, parents, and healthcare professionals at the end of a child's life must be grounded in caring and compassionate relationships. Seems kind of obvious. And they go on to say that these relationships require particular skill, knowledge, and attitudes that are not fully addressed in many approaches to communication training currently available. It's actually not explicitly part of a lot of curricula. It's part of why we've included this talk in this series of talks that we're putting together. What about for teachers in schools? So we've kind of made the case that although physicians have clearly signed up to be part of this process, it may not be being as openly taught as we'd like it to be. Are teachers in schools doing this any better? I was a high school teacher. I had an appointment at the Graduate School of Education here at Harvard and a dual appointment at the med school. So I've been parts of both of those curricula, written about it from both perspectives, and we'll get to that a little bit later. What I can tell you is that actually schools don't feel set up for this either. The Journal of School Nursing in 2000 wrote that this is an ongoing struggle. There's prolonged grief and struggle for students, teachers, and the school community. And prolonged is really the key word there. You as the consultant, as the pediatrician, the child psychiatrist, whoever happens to be asked by the school to play a role here, your job is to actually help them create some order to know how long to grieve. If you think about it, religious observances of grieving actually are very, very structured. They're very rule-oriented, and that's precisely so that you can know when to begin and when to end, because otherwise you feel kind of lost in the process. It remains very difficult to know what to do and how to do it. Professor Holland is a very well-known expert in the grief process, specifically in schools in the United Kingdom, and he's been studying this forever, and he writes that, look, although we've had a good deal of attention in training and bereavement counseling in schools, it's still problematic. We still don't know how to do it. There's a lack of standardization. We actually haven't even studied what works well yet to the extent that we ought to. It's kind of a sad reality that kids die, and when they die, we get called in to talk to the schools. We don't really have good studies looking at sort of various ways that are all acceptable and seeing what seems to be correlated best with the kids doing well and the families doing well and the communities doing well. So that's actually work to be done, and maybe some of you could do that work. And as I said, none of this is an indictment. It's super hard. It's very, very hard to be involved in the passing away of a child who has meaning to you in a community that has meaning to you. We have to kind of think the unthinkable, and you know, I recognize that this may seem a distance from the sort of more classic practice of medicine, but 50 years ago this was the practice of medicine. You read all of Osler's quotes, for example, they are all about this, and this is actually the kind of thing that I think drew many of us into medical school. When I read the student essays of the ones applying to medical school, they almost always talk about wanting to be part of this process. Something happens in our training that inches us away from it. So I want to encourage us all to sort of bring us back to that, because the life cycle is a very powerful thing, and part of the life cycle includes passing away. So as colleagues with me, Dr. Jelinek, Mike Jelinek, Dr. Jeff Bostic, myself, we were recognizing that we'd been called an awful lot by various schools in our various roles. Mike Jelinek, at the time that we wrote this, was the division chief of child and adolescent psychiatry at Mass General. He's also the president of Newton Wellesley Hospital, which is a local hospital here in Boston. Also happens to be a pediatrician in addition to being a child psychiatrist. Jeff Bostic has a master's degree in education and a doctorate in education. He's also the head of the school consultation group. I was at that point in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. We were getting called all the time by by schools to come in and help when somebody had passed away. And we had a kind of iterative knowledge. Like we said, well, this seemed to work, this didn't work. We'd been called to crisis situations where many children had died, maybe in a bus accident, which happened not too long ago. And we recognized that things could go very awry if there was a kind of lack of clear guidance. So rather than write an article, which we had done for the medical community, we thought, why don't we reach out to the schools themselves? And so we contacted the Journal Educational Leadership, which is part of the sort of larger association whose job it is to cater to administrators, to principals, assistant principals, guidance counselors. It's actually a very well-known education journal within the educational community. And we said, we would like to write about this. And they said, my goodness, that would be great. We have not had anybody offer, and we feel kind of equally lost in this. So we called it what it was. We wrote an article called When a Student Dies that was published in November 2007. And as I said, it was based to some extent on the research that exists, but there's not that much research, so it's also based on our iterative experience from ourselves and colleagues. And what I'd like to do, having given you the introduction now, is draw from that article. You can find that article online as well. And then sort of make final suggestions based on the conclusions that we drew from that article. So what's the most important rule? You're a pediatrician, say, in the community, and let's say you have a consulting relationship with a local school, and a child happens to die there. And children pass away for a number of reasons. For chronic illnesses, there might be a sudden accident, there could be a suicide. All awful things to sort of confront as a community and as a school. But they reach out to us because that's typically been the job of the physician. So the pediatrician gets a call. First thing you need to remember is to be incredibly concrete in your recommendations, much more concrete than you think you need to be. Schools are really kind of swimming right now in a lot of anxiety when those things happen. So whatever you say, make sure you say it very clearly. If you don't know what to say, that's fine, but you say that then. Say, I'm not sure what to say. Let me speak with some colleagues and get back to you. Schools are at such a loss right now, they need somebody to kind of create ownership. It's the same thing you do on a plane. So if somebody gets very sick on a plane and they say, is there a doctor available? What they're really saying is, can somebody own this on the plane? They need clear and specific guidance so that ownership can take place and people cannot feel so kind of left to blow in the wind, basically, when something awful has happened. So then the schools will say, okay, fine, you've offered to help us. What do we do? What's our first thing? The very first thing, and this is, people often get this wrong, the first thing, before you have a big assembly, before you make a huge announcement, before you make any kind of public guidance to the larger school community, is you establish a crisis team. And this is very important because schools, in creating ownership of the crisis, reestablish the hierarchy of the school. And hierarchies really matter in this point. This is why in religious observances there's a guider, somebody who guides you through the morning process. In a very similar way, there's going to be a crisis team at the school that you can help them to set up. What we found most useful is to have the principal be the leader of that, because the principal is the sort of face of the school. He is or she is the designated leader. The assistant principal is going to be part of that. There's either a guidance or an adjustment counseling department in almost all schools. They should be part of either within the district or the one who's in the school themselves, and the school nurse. Unless you are a physician who happens to have a clinic within the school, in one of the school-based clinics where your office is in the school itself, which is happening increasingly, unless you're in that group, you're not part of this team. You exist in an advisory role, not as a member of the team. And the reason for that is you're a foreign face to the school. So, you know, the principal may know you, the assistant principal may know you, the guidance department may know you, but the rest of the teachers and the parents don't know you. And it's very unsettling if a foreign face is brought in to talk about something that feels so intimate. So what you say, unless you're under the roof of their building and employed by the school, you say, look, I'm going to be part of this team, and you can call me whenever, and I will function in an advisory capacity, but I don't want to be a member of this team. I want the messages, I want the spoken word of what we're going to do here to come out of all of your mouths. This allows the school officials to retain ownership of the crisis as it evolves. Once that team is in place, then you go back and you do a kind of post-mortem analysis. It's not that different from what we do in the hospital all the time. You want to make sure you know exactly what happened. You want to be on message. So all those members of the team say, okay, what do we know? What are the exact facts that we know? And this, I've actually been at these meetings where they'll have a chalkboard and they'll say, here are the facts, and then we'll look at those and say, actually, you know, that one right there, that they were drinking while they were driving, that may not be true. That's conjecture at this point. So then we'll divide it away from conjecture, because it's incredibly dangerous to say, even in a hinted way, that you know what happened if you don't. So instead what you should do is acknowledge the unknowns. We don't know the circumstance under which this car crashed. We hope to find out, and we will make information available as it becomes available. And one of the jobs of the crisis team is to decide how and in what venue you'll make this information available. So the initial announcement that somebody has passed away, and inevitably somebody in the community is going to know, but it has to be made in a kind of broader way. That decision gets made by the crisis team after they've established exactly what it is they do know. And that's very important, because otherwise you get rumors started, and that's very destabilizing for the school in its process of grieving. This also involves the family, of course. The family's lost a loved one, a child, and this is a real balancing act, because the family may have information that you may be privy to as the pediatrician, or that the assistant principal, the guidance counselor may be privy to, but the family may not be entirely comfortable with revealing this information. This may be especially the case in things like suicide, but it could happen in a number of circumstances. I've seen plenty of kids pass away from illnesses like cancer, and the family's just not prepared to have that be a public thing for their own reasons, and that's a different topic. We need to honor that, but at the same time, we should help schools to know that the lack of willingness to be forthcoming about what they're comfortable with, about how the child passed away, has the potential to generate some harmful conjecture among the students in the school. That's really important. So it's this real balancing act to say to the family, what are you comfortable with our saying? And then if you're okay with what they say, then you move forward with your plan. If it feels to you like they're saying a little too much or not enough, you might say, look, I think what you're saying is not the best message we want to get across. Let me tell you why. Ultimately, you have to honor the family's wishes. It's very, very important as a school. It's certainly important as the pediatrician to honor the family's wishes, but now you're consulting to a school, so instead of taking care of just a family or just a smaller system, you're taking care of a very large organic unit, a school community. So you're balancing these two kind of obligations at the same time. Once you're ready as a crisis team to let others know, you can't do it all at once. First of all, it's overwhelming and there's burnout to sort of tell one person after another that something awful, that the captain of the football team has died, as happened recently here in Boston. So what you do is you tell the other teachers first. Remember, there's a smaller crisis team. They got to let the teachers know. And we've been very explicit and concrete in our recommendations there. We've said establish a phone chain. Don't have one person call all 75 or 100 or whatever teachers in the school or in the district. Have one teacher call another 4, have another call another 4, another 4. This is the way any phone chain works. That guards against the sort of burnout of delivering or redelivering this kind of news, which can be very, very weighty for people and can also affect the grieving process downstream. And then you really need to check in with the school, and this should be done by the principal, by the leader of this team. And usually it's in the context of faculty meetings that are either before or after school for the next week or longer. And what you're going to do is monitor the state of the school and the teachers. You're just going to check in. You're going to say, how are things going? Is there anything that's worrying you? Have you noticed anything in the schools that we ought to pay attention to that seems different than before this tragedy happened? These help the school to feel comfortable that somebody's in charge. I've been in an awful lot of crisis circumstances where multiple teams come in and each one tries to own the message. And what happens with the schools and the kids is they hear multiple messages, and that actually is incredibly unsettling. So, to give you an example, there was a bus accident that I alluded to earlier. We arrived, a team from Mass General, as did a team from other organizations, I think it was the Red Cross. All of us had the best of intentions. We had different approaches. Nobody had run it through the principal. The principal wasn't meeting with us, which wasn't the principal's fault. Nothing was set up. But as a result, we were dispersed amongst the students, and some of us were saying to do one thing, another group were saying to do something else, and the students went and talked to each other, and they said, well, these guys don't know how to help us at all. If they did, they wouldn't be telling us all these different things. So if there's a way that you can hold these faculty meetings, it's a way of kind of making sure that people are still on message with exactly what we know, how we know what we know, and what we're comfortable having the students know. There are going to be things to watch for. So when I said you have these faculty meetings and you say, what have you noticed that might worry you? These are the things that we've seen most often. This is the area where there actually tends to be a fair amount of data, especially the contagion effect, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. There's potential retaliatory motions from the kids. If there's a car accident and people feel that somebody else hit this kid and took this kid's life, we've seen moments where sort of plans are made. I actually saw this in a gang hit in an area of Boston where there was a stray bullet that happened to take the life of a middle school kid. And in response, other kids in the school, out of kind of not knowing what to do with their despair, decided they were going to go after this family or the kid who had fired the gun. You want to keep your ear to the wall and tell the teachers to do that as well, to sort of watch for those things. There are obviously much more pro-social ways to recognize and be loyal to your friends other than retaliation. There's also the potential, and this one's a little bit harder, for romanticizing the death, and this is especially dangerous with suicide. We know about the contagion effect. The CDC has guidelines for the contagion effect. That's when there's a suicide within the school. The risk for other attempts on their own lives from other students within the school actually goes up for about 2 weeks following the event, at least according to the data that exists. And one of the ways you prevent against that is romanticizing the death. You would never say something like, Sally struggled with depression, but in the end, her grief was so great and her suffering was such that she was not able to fight it anymore, because it has a kind of poetic ring to it that is especially resonant for an adolescent population. What you would say is, she died from depression. If any of you are having struggles with depression, and importantly, you don't say this in large groups, you say this in small groups, please let us know so that we can help you with this. All of this is to prevent the onset of despair, which is a real term. It's not just a general term here. It's in social studies or social scientist studies. They've defined despair really as a kind of inability to move beyond the event itself. That's why there has to be a crisis team that can put boundaries around how you're going to mourn and what way you're going to mourn, what the memorial will look like, so that the school can move forward, doesn't get kind of mired in the despair that stops them from continuing to be a community. So who needs help and when do they need help? That's your next step on the agenda. So rather than having, and this actually has been studied, if you have a large assembly and say we lost one of our most today, and if you do that before you meet with the very close friends of that person, the close friends of that person often feel very put out. They feel that this was unfair to them, that yeah, everybody in the school is upset, but they can't even begin to understand what we're feeling. All it takes is at first meeting with the close friends, which is a very difficult meeting, but so important, and say, you know, Johnny died. You may have known that Johnny was sick, or you may not have known because it was a sudden death. Whatever, Johnny has passed away. We wanted to let you guys know first because you're his friends. There's always the risk that you'll leave out a friend. So you might say when you meet with them, is there anybody else you think who should be at this meeting before we begin it? These are very, very concrete recommendations that I think help us to make sure we don't have people feel left out. At the same time, there's going to be vulnerable students in the community. There's going to be students who have recently had experiences with death, usually the death of a parent, but it could be a sibling, or they may have themselves sort of fought off death. They're going to have a rekindling of earlier traumatic experiences and of earlier bereavement. So the guidance counselors are often aware of that. They'll reach out to those students and they'll say, look, this just happened. We wanted to let you know because we know you've recently had an experience with this. Please know that our door is open. And then after that, you let everybody know. Schools are communities, they are organic, so what you will do is start with the close friends, move to the vulnerable students, and then you might have a large assembly. It's not the kind of thing you make as an announcement over a loudspeaker. It is the kind of thing you do in a face-to-face way. Certainly not the kind of thing you do in email alone. It's okay to send out the email, but if that's the only communication, it's very, very off-putting to the students and the parents. Because after all, they also get emails about things like student-teacher conferences or who won the football game. So it needs to be a much more personal connection than those other maybe more mundane announcements. The issue of memorials actually has stirred up a lot of folks, and when we've been called in, and my pediatric colleagues have been called in, we're often asked, well, what do we do? Like, how do we establish a memorial? And all of us are familiar with memorials that sort of form like they're trees at the site of where a child may have passed away, and newspaper clippings are left, flowers are left, teddy bears, balloons, things like that. They're incredibly moving, but they also run some risk for the school because they can kind of spiral out of control, and by that I mean there can be some competitiveness among the students, just the way students are wired, about who can sort of show the most grief. And that's not a healthy setting for kids, as you can imagine. You want the community to grieve together. So when you start to think about memorials, you should decide, where are we going to do it? In other words, where will the memorial be placed? How are we going to remember this kid? So in what method will the memorial be operated? Will it be a statue? Will it be a stadium or a baseball field? I'm just thinking of examples I've seen. Will there be a room named for the kid? How long will the temporary memorial be up? Because there's usually a temporary one, then a more permanent one. And then once all those things are decided, you let the school community know very explicitly, we will be having a book that you can sign that will be present for the next 4 weeks in the guidance counselor's office, and you walk in and sign it. After that 4-week period, we will reconvene, the leadership group will, the crisis team will, with friends and with family, decide what the most appropriate permanent memorial is, and then we'll let all of you know. That's an example of what you can help the schools to say to their student body and to their teacher body so that they can understand what to expect as they move forward. There are differences. There's ways that kids pass away, and those specific circumstances actually direct your guidance in different ways as well. So I want to spend some time on that. Accidents, actually the most common cause of death for kids are accidents, motor vehicle accidents most commonly. Those are sudden. You don't have a chance to say goodbye. That's actually one of the hardest things. That's what kids most often say. I just saw him yesterday and now he's passed away. With that suddenness comes the implication that the death could have been avoided. Like if only, you know, Billy hadn't had that six-pack of beer, he wouldn't have flipped his car. There's all sorts of conjectures that can come out of that, and from that comes that retaliation that I talked about against the survivors as a kind of act of loyalty. So it could be something as obvious as that shooting that I mentioned, where you go after the person who pulled the trigger, but more often it's something like, we never should have let him leave that party when he did. So that's obviously a teenager example. We never should have let, in our community we had a tree fall on somebody. We shouldn't have let that child walk home on that stormy day. Those kinds of, well, we shouldn't have done that, and we're angry, and we're going to make new rules, they usually are not that helpful. You could say something like, well, let's get and as we did in our community, let's get the tree department involved to make sure that the trees themselves are stable so that it is an excessively windy day. We've done all that we can, but at the end of the day, the likelihood of a tree falling on you is really, really, really low, and helping people to kind of put that risk into perspective. What you're most importantly going to do with accidents is bring close friends together and find ways that they can express their loyalty in more pro-social ways. Retaliation is never pro-social, obviously, but you could say, well, what we're going to do is establish an anti-gang wing in the school, or we're going to establish kind of better checks and balances on our own use of alcohol, or something like that, some set of rules that the students sign up for in order to prevent these kinds of awful things from going forward that doesn't involve taking their anger out on somebody else in any kind of dangerous way. Suicide, I said accidents are the first leading cause. Suicide is the third leading cause in death among teens, so it's a significant public health concern. It's particularly rare in younger kids. You don't see it that often, but as kids enter adolescence, actually the rate goes up, and actually the rate went up for the first time in 15 years. Not too long ago, 2008, 2009. Now it seems to be stabling off again. The risk is more common in spring. I don't know what to do with that statistic. It's just sort of interesting. You know, Eliot in, I think it was Prufrock wrote, April is the cruelest month. There is something about springtime where people get agitated and activated and are more likely to act impulsively. It doesn't mean you won't have suicides at other times of year, but you might be more on guard for suicidal ideation among your students during the springtime. There is a big risk with suicide in that it stirs up anger, which is understandable. You get very angry at the person for having taken their life. You feel uncomfortable with that anger, especially because it feels bad to be angry at somebody who's no longer with us. So you transfer that anger onto the staff and other students, and just letting people be aware of that potential tends to head that potential off at the pass. The bigger risk is the contagion effect that I talked about. Others might see suicide as a viable option. It turns out if you have a large assembly following a suicide and you say, you know, this happened and we don't want it to happen again, so we brought in this expert who you've never seen before and to talk to you about how awful suicide is, you actually at best do nothing, and at worst, according to a lot of studies, actually make things worse. It's contraindicated to do that. You should not have a large assembly to talk about something like suicide and depression. You should do this in small groups, privately if need be. Homerooms are good places. If you do it in large groups, what happens is people say, well, they don't care about me. They're talking to 500 people right now. How can they possibly know the way I'm suffering? Whereas in smaller groups, people say, well, maybe they are speaking directly to me and maybe I have an opportunity to go listen. It seems, again, kind of obvious that the smaller the group, the more intimate the message. You want to check in frequently and privately, especially with those who are closest to the deceased, with the suicide contagion effect. According to research done by the Association for Suicide Prevention as well as the CDC, it's those who are closest who either had very close relationships with the kid or who are maybe one step removed on the same football team or something like that. They're the ones who are at that greatest risk. You want to check in with them a lot and just say, how are you doing? Look, we know that sometimes when this happens, other people consider taking their own lives. You got to say it. You should say those words. There is no evidence at all that suggests saying that will make people more likely to take their lives. Instead, you just say, we know that sometimes when a close friend kills themselves, other friends consider it. We want to check in with you and make sure that you're not, and if you are, find some help for you. And this is usually, again, best done by the guidance department at the school. You don't want to bring in a strange face to be asking these very sensitive questions. You want to have a face that's at least somewhat familiar to the students. Chronic illnesses are different, so that's the work I've done in the transplant service, where most kids do live, but not everybody does. You have, in some ways, time to say goodbye. There have been studies, actually, of having hospice occur within the schools. So kids, even as everybody knows that they're most likely going to die, that's why they're in hospice, there are hospice nurses within the school itself. And there's been sort of mixed results with that, looking at how the teachers and the students respond. What we know is that you get this kind of mortality anxiety, especially among teenagers and younger, but teenagers really need to feel that in some way they can't die. They know intellectually that they can, but in order for them to be comfortable moving away from their parents and eventually leaving home, college work, whatever, it's very frightening for them to have a friend pass away, and it occurs to them that they could pass away, and this leads to regression. I know this sounds very shrinky. I happen to be a shrink, so it's easy for me to say these things. As people regress, they start thinking like you think when you're a little kid, where you're very prone to magical thinking. So you start to wonder, it's contagious. Maybe that cancer is contagious. Maybe that kid who had leukemia has a disease that I could have gotten. I spent time with them, so now I'm going to get leukemia. And we've seen this in other kids, and they feel kind of ashamed of noting it because they know that it rationally doesn't make sense. Similarly, they'll start to feel guilty. They'll say, it shouldn't have been him. It should have been me. I wasn't a good student. My parents don't love me as much, so why did Sally have to die? I should have died. Or maybe I made him sick. If I hadn't taken him out to so many parties or gone on so many dates or broken up with him or her, maybe they wouldn't have gotten this horrible illness. This is what toddlers do all the time. And pediatricians will sit down with toddlers and say, you didn't do this. You need to know you didn't do this. If you're worried that you did this, please tell me, we'll talk about it. But you need to remember also that all of us, kids and adults, regress in stressful times. And when you regress, it means you go backwards in the way you look at the world, and you are prone to these relapses of magical thinking. So again, you speak very concretely with the students. Leukemia is not contagious. You may be worried that it is, but it's not. This is very sad, but there's no reason this should have been you. This is the way life works. These are, again, things that were taken much more in stride 50 plus years ago and are still taken much more in stride in developing nations. But in our nation, we've gotten less good at talking about these things. How long do we engage in the mourning process? And schools have asked this of pediatricians and psychiatrists for a long time. And of course, there's no one answer. You don't say 22.3 days. What you say is it's unique among individuals and among schools. The individuals here are the members of the crisis team and the family and the school. Schools themselves have their unique culture. We do know that if you prematurely return to the normal routine, that's seen as kind of lacking in compassion. You need to give the school time to recognize that something awful has taken place and have them kind of learn to cope with it. At the same time, if you go on forever, it's really burdensome and overwhelming, and that despair that I talked about sets in. So again, you have constant communication with the crisis team that then goes out to the school and the community, and it's very, very specific. You say, where is the funeral? Where will it be held? Let the school know that. Where's the memorial in the school? This is assuming the family wants the school to be there. Where will the memorial be? How long will the memorial be there? In what way will we establish a more permanent memorial? All of that stuff is decided first so that everyone's on message, on the crisis team, with your consultation if you're a member of that consultory team, and then you're going to go out and tell the rest of the school and the community. General recommendations, right after the event, right after somebody's passed away, on-hand extra support helps. So this doesn't always have to be the guidance department. It could be, but you might not have enough members who feel sort of comfortable with this open-door policy, so then you might bring in consultants. That's a role that I've and others have played. Usually about 5 days. We just sort of chose that number when schools have asked us because it's the length of the school week. So you have an open-door policy. You don't have to make appointments. You can, but you don't have to. Kids can come by. They can say, I just need 10 minutes. I need an hour. They step in. They talk. They leave. We recommend very strongly against having one of those kind of tree-growing, organic, flower-like memorials because it kind of leads to this competition about who can establish the most genuine memorial. I have this newspaper clipping. I have this photo. I have this yearbook thing. People can share that among themselves, but the school, and representing its attempts to establish a memorial, what's actually worked best for us is to have a book that usually sits either in the guidance office or in the front office, and kids can come in whenever they want, and they can write their thoughts about what's happened. Leave that book available, and let kids know how long it's going to be available. For, in this case, 4 weeks is a good amount of time. So say for the next month, we will have a book in the principal's office just outside. You can come in and sign, or maybe it's in a private place so people don't have to see you sign. It doesn't have to be. But 4 weeks is the important part because you want to give kids time to think about what they're going to say and then give them time to sort of get up the courage to write it down, because these are hard things to get out in words. After that, the book needs to go away because the school needs to move on. There will be many well-intentioned people who will need guidance. Parents from the community will come out. All these folks mean very, very well. The problem is if they don't have anybody to report to, and if there's nobody reporting to them, they're going to take matters into their own hands, and then that creates that kind of disorganized response that can, among the students, create even more panic because they feel like no one's kind of running the ship. So there usually is a designated member of the crisis team. Could be the principal, could be somebody that the principal assigns. Every parent or community member who calls or who shows up at the school to help, direct them to that member of the crisis team. We do the same thing in the hospitals all the time, right? When there's a huge family and somebody always wants news, we'll say to them, well, let's have mom be the receiver of the news. We can give the news to mom, or if mom's not up for it, understandably, it could be an uncle or something like that. You're going to do the same thing here. You're going to have a designated person whose job it is to both convey news to the community and also to receive news from the community, and then to direct people either away if you don't need them in a nice way, or to direct them to the appropriate places. In establishing a permanent memorial, there's some guidelines that I think really matter here. There's a tendency to want to put the permanent memorial at the very site of the death. So if a child, we had this recently, it's weird how many of these, I guess because I get called on them. So there was a little girl who passed away of just a random arrhythmia on the soccer field. She just died on the soccer field. People wanted to put a memorial on the soccer field itself that people could run over as if they were running over the place where she died all the time, was what they would be doing. And that we haven't found to be so useful. We don't put graves in the ground at the spot where somebody dies. We ritualize it with graveyards or whatever our potential cultural guidelines tell us to do. In deciding this, we should turn to our cultural guidelines. So we meet with the friends and the family and the community, and the most important thing to say is, well, what would Billy want his memorial to look like? If Billy was really into baseball, maybe the baseball field can be named after him, as has happened multiple times. You want to ask that question so that the memorial appropriately reflects Billy and his family's thoughts and memories that they'd like to preserve about Billy. And then support, more support. This is super important. You know, there's something about medical training where we're supposed to be able just to handle this and hold on to it and go home and have dinner with our kids and look at them and not worry that they won't die someday. And we know it intellectually that, of course, everyone's at risk of dying. That's the way life works. But we forget that. So if we can call up our colleagues when these things happen, as my dad did in the intensive care unit, as I mentioned, as I do probably at least once or twice a month when I'm feeling overwhelmed by the suffering of my patients, and as you can advise the teachers to do, they know each other best. So if they can be available to each other for support, that will hugely help the school to move forward. With that, it's support. What do? We get back to that stuff that Osler talked about, the stuff that the doctor said to Laertes in Hamlet. We acknowledge that an early death doesn't equal an unlived life. There's a tendency to say, well, if this person passed away at age 10, it's as if they were never alive, or it's as if their life somehow didn't have an arc to it, and every life has a story to it, and we need to kind of remember that. That helps to reinforce the values of the school and the community, because schools and communities are all about creating narratives that kids can look back on. Say, I did this in school, this is what like the beginning was, the middle, the end was. And we use our community to get through difficult times. In fact, that's the most robust predictor of getting through difficult times. It's the willingness to reach out to our community that extends outward in concentric circles, from the crisis team to the teachers, to the ancillary staff at the school, to the consultation group, which could include you, and then you reaching out to your community. That use of community is the absolute most robust predictor of bereavement going forward in a way that's valuable and helpful in allowing schools to move on. So, in summary, I don't know that I said anything that you don't know, but what I hope to have done is to bring things to the front of your consciousness. And the reason I'm saying that is I've just been in a lot of circumstances, including ones that I myself not had in the front of my consciousness, where I've been called, just walked into a school where somebody happens to have died, and not had in my mind clear guidelines of where I'd like to go with this. There's not much training either in schools or among those who consult the schools about how to cope with this. So because there's not much training, we need to stick to what we do know, and what matters most of all is being very concrete in your recommendations and your response in order to maximize the chance for resiliency, because that's really the goal here. It's to help the school to remember the child and at the same time to bounce back from this event and to move forward. So I hope this has been helpful, and thank you very much.